The cold of the vinyl seat seeped through Helen's thin jeans, a relentless chill that had settled deep in her bones. It was the third night they had spent in the cab of the old pickup truck, and the space was already thick with the smells of stale crackers, gasoline, and despair. Her son, Luke, only 10 years old, slept fitfully beside her, his small form curled into a ball, his face pale in the faint orange glow of a distant street lamp. A year. It had been a year since her husband's last breath. A year since the mountain of medical bills had begun to avalanche, burying them alive. She listened to the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in the window, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the hollowness inside her chest. Her hands, the calloused hands of a seamstress, were clenched in her lap, idle and useless. The world had shrunk to this cramped, cold metal box, a rolling coffin filled with the ghosts of a life they no longer had. Her heart ached with a physical, grinding pain. Carefully, so as not to wake Luke, Helen reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled wad of cash. It was all that was left. She smoothed the bills on the dashboard, her fingers tracing the faces of dead presidents under the weak dome light. $50, $100, $200, $500. $500 stood between them, and absolute zero. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot of hunger, a sensation she was becoming far too familiar with. The eviction notice had been the final blow. The landlord's voice, devoid of sympathy, still rang in her ears as they carried their few possessions, a mattress, some clothes, her silent sewing machine, and piled them into the truck bed, a sad monument to their failure. She remembered the shame, the feeling of neighbors' eyes on her back, as she drove away from the only home Luke had ever known. Now that $500 wasn't a safety net. It was a tightrope, and they were suspended over an abyss. A wave of nausea rose in Helen's throat as she looked at her son's sleeping face. His eyelashes fluttered, a small frown creasing his brow even in his dreams. A quiet, choked sob caught in her throat, and she had to bite her lip to keep it from escaping. She could not break. Not now. Not in front of him. She was his rock, but she felt like sand, crumbling away with every passing hour. Tears burned behind her eyes, hot and unshed. The silence was a heavy blanket, broken only by Luke's soft breaths and the low rumble of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway, shaking their small vehicle. She closed her eyes, but all she saw was the sterile white of the hospital room. All she heard was the rhythmic, indifferent beep of the machines that had counted down the final moments of her husband's life. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She felt a profound, chilling loneliness that was worse than the cold. A sharp gust of wind forced its way through the windowsill, and Helen shivered violently, pulling the thin, worn-out blanket tighter around Luke's shoulders. He murmured in his sleep and snuggled closer to her warmth. They were parked in the dark corner of a desolate truck stop, trying to be invisible, but Helen felt terribly exposed. Every pair of headlights that swept across the parking lot sent a jolt of pure fear through her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What if a police officer knocked on their window? What if some predator noticed a lone woman and a child, vulnerable and trapped? The world, which had once felt full of opportunity, now seemed populated only by threats. She rested her head against the cold glass of the window, her breath fogging the pain. Her stomach ached, a dull, persistent pain born of hunger and anxiety. She felt like a cornered animal, every nerve ending frayed, every sense on high alert for the danger she was sure was lurking just outside in the darkness. As the first sliver of grey dawn light broke over the horizon, illuminating the dust and grime on the windshield, a grim resolve hardened within Helen. They couldn't do this again. Another night spent hiding in the shadows, another day of aimless waiting for the end. The $500 in her pocket felt like a burning coal, a final, desperate chance. It wasn't enough to rebuild, but maybe it was enough for a miracle, or at least a gamble. She turned the key in the ignition. The old engine protested with a groan and a shudder before catching, its rough idle a symphony of decay. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to move. With Luke still sleeping peacefully beside her, she pulled out of the truck stop and onto the open highway. The road stretched out before them, an empty ribbon of asphalt leading into the unknown. The gas gauge, hovering just above a quarter tank, was a ticking clock, and she was driving into a future that was completely, terrifyingly blank. For 2 days, they drove. The miles blurred into a monotonous cycle of grey asphalt, tired diners, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of the fuel gauge. The $500 used tucked safely in her bra felt less like a comfort and more like a countdown timer. Luke was awake now, his initial sleepy compliance worn away by boredom and confusion. "Where are we going, Mum?" he'd ask, his small voice filled with a trust she felt she no longer deserved. Helen would force a smile, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. "On an adventure," she'd reply, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. The landscape outside was as barren as her prospects, flat and brown and endless. With every mile, the hope she had clung to in the pre-dawn darkness felt more and more like a delusion. She felt the crushing fatigue in her very bones, a weariness so profound it felt like the start of a permanent surrender. The engine's drone was the only sound, a constant reminder of their isolation, a funeral dirge for the life they had lost and the future that refused to appear. They pulled into a town that felt like it had been forgotten by time itself. Peeling paint hung from the facades of shuttered buildings, and the few people on the sidewalks moved with a slow, weary shuffle. It was called Harmony Creek, a name so cruelly ironic it made Helen's stomach clench. She parked the truck in front of a dusty general store, the only sign of life on the main street. The air smelled of damp soil and defeat. She watched Luke stare out the window at a faded mural of a smiling family from a bygone era, and she felt a fresh wave of failure wash over her. They were ghosts here, invisible spectres drifting through a town that was already a graveyard of dreams. Her own dream of finding a new start, a safe place, seemed to be dying right here, in this sad, dilapidated place. The silence in the cab was thick with unspoken fears. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as she realized their gas tanks and their options were nearly empty. This was it. They had reached the end of the road. It was then she saw it. Nailed crookedly to a weathered telephone pole, half hidden by overgrown weeds, was a piece of cardboard. The writing was crude, done in thick black marker, the ink bleeding from a past rain. Land or house, cheap. Below it, a phone number. The words were a jolt. A sudden, unexpected flicker of light in the oppressive gloom. House. The word resonated deep within her, a primal call for shelter and security. Her logical mind screamed that it was a trap, a scam, that nothing good could come this cheap. But logic was a luxury she could no longer afford. Desperation was her new currency. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Could this be it? A sign. She felt a dizzying, terrifying surge of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, but it was there. A tiny ember glowing in the cold emptiness of her soul. She grabbed a pen from the glove compartment, her hand shaking as she scribbled the number on a crumpled napkin. Her fingers felt numb and clumsy as she dialed the number on her cheap, prepaid phone, the last connection to a world she no longer felt part of. The phone rang 3 times, each ring echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. Finally, a man answered. His voice was a low growl, thick with disinterest, like gravel being scraped across concrete. "Yeah," he grunted. Helen's own voice came out as a weak, reedy whisper. I'm calling about the land for sale." There was a pause. She could hear the sound of a television blaring in the background. "The one off Old Mill Road?" he asked. "Yeah, 500 cash. Deeds ready. You want it or not?" There was no sales pitch, no attempt to describe the property, only a stark take-it-or-leave-it finality. Every instinct screamed at her to hang up, to run. But the image of Luke sleeping in the cold truck flashed in her mind. "I'll take it," she said, the words sealing her fate. The decision left her breathless, a knot of pure terror tightening in her stomach. The meeting took place in a small, suffocatingly hot office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The man, whose name was Silas, didn't stand when she entered. He was a large, slovenly figure, his bulk overflowing the chair behind a cluttered metal desk. He grunted a greeting and pushed a single yellowed piece of paper towards her. The deed. His eyes, small and buried in his fleshy face, flickered to the bulge in her coat where she had moved the money. He didn't ask her name. Didn't ask why a woman with a child in tow wanted to buy a property no one else had touched in years. He just wanted the cash. Helen took a deep breath, the foul air burning her lungs, and pulled out the wad of bills, her last $500. As she laid the money on the desk, She felt a physical pang, as if she were surrendering a vital organ. He snatched the bills, counted them with a wet thumb, then scrawled a signature on the deed and pushed it back at her. "So it's yours," he grunted, already turning his attention back to a game on his phone. Clutching the deed and a crudely drawn map Silas had provided, Helen felt a dizzying mix of panic and exhilaration. There was no turning back now. She had gambled everything they had on a piece of paper and a gruff voice on the phone. As she started the truck, Luke, who had been waiting patiently, bounced in his seat. "Did we get it, Mom? Do we have a house now?" His face was alight with pure, unadulterated joy, and it was a knife to Helen's heart. She forced another smile, her facial muscles aching with the effort. "We did, sweetie. We have our very own place now." The hope in his eyes was a fragile flame she had to protect at all costs, even as a cold, coiling dread began to settle deep in her gut. What had she done? The map was a mess of squiggly lines leading off the main road and into a patch of dense green that was simply marked woods. She prayed, with an intensity that surprised her, that she hadn't just led them from one disaster into another, far worse one. The drive was short, but it felt like a journey to another world. The paved road of Harmony Creek quickly gave way to a pitted gravel track that rattled the old truck violently, making the junk in the back clatter and shift. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The friendly open fields were swallowed up by a dense, intimidating forest. Tall, dark pine trees pressed in on both sides of the narrow lane, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking out the sun and casting the road in a permanent, gloomy twilight. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. A profound sense of isolation began to creep over Helen, prickling the hairs on her arms. There were no other houses, no mailboxes, no signs of human life at all. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under their tires. Her stomach churned with a nauseous blend of hope and fear. They were leaving everything behind, driving deeper and deeper into a wilderness that felt ancient and unwelcoming. They found it exactly where the map indicated. A pair of rusted iron gates, one hanging precariously from a single hinge, marked the entrance. A faded, bullet-riddled sign nailed to a tree read, "Beware of dog," though the lettering was nearly obscured by moss and time. Helen stopped the truck, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She killed the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was deafening. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, watchful stillness that seemed to press in on the cab of the truck. A lone crow cried out from a high branch, the sound sharp and jarring like a warning. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced a path down her spine. This place felt wrong. It felt abandoned not just by people, but by hope itself. Luke, sensing her tension, grew quiet beside her. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small. Helen couldn't answer. She could only stare at the overgrown track that led from the gate into the suffocating darkness of the trees. Taking a shaky breath, she put the truck in gear and eased it past the broken gate. The track was even worse here, 2 deep ruts carved into the mud, and tree branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. After another 100 yards, the woods opened into a small, gloomy clearing, and there it was. Helen slammed on the brakes, the truck lurching to a stop. The air rushed out of her lungs in a choked gasp. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even a fixer-upper. It was a grave. A blackened, skeletal ruin stood silhouetted against the grey sky, a jagged wound in the landscape. The fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured, the one that had carried her through the last few hours, shattered into a million pieces. The silence in the truck was no longer just quiet. It was the sound of absolute despair. For a long moment, neither she nor Luke moved or spoke. They could only stare at the catastrophic reality of her $500 gamble. It was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, Helen opened the truck door. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It was a thick, sickening stench of old fire, a combination of wet, cold ash, pervasive mold, and the underlying rot of damp wood. It clung to the back of her throat and made her want to gag. She stepped out onto the spongy, dark earth, her cheap sneakers sinking slightly into the muck. The air was cold and heavy, clinging to her skin like a damp shroud. She heard a soft crunch behind her and turned to see Luke standing there, his small hand reaching for hers. His grip was vice-like, his knuckles white. He didn't say a word, but his wide, terrified eyes reflected the devastation before them. The world seemed to shrink to this one blighted spot, this clearing of ash and ruin under a sky the color of lead. The only sound was the mournful whisper of the wind as it sifted through the charred remains of her last, desperate hope. The house was a carcass. Where walls should have been, there were only blackened, jagged timbers clawing at the sky like the ribs of some great fallen beast. The fire that had destroyed this place must have been an inferno, a hungry, hateful thing. It had devoured everything. The roof had collapsed entirely inward, creating a treacherous pit of charred beams, broken shingles and debris, all slick with rain and coated in a sickly green film of moss. Black soot stained the stone foundation in long weeping streaks, as if the house itself had cried tears of ash. It was a monument to destruction. Helen felt a wave of vertigo, her vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't a home. This was a horror. It was the physical manifestation of her own life, a structure that had once held love and warmth, now just a hollowed-out, burnt-out shell. A profound sense of nausea rose in her throat, and yet, in the very center of the devastation, one thing remained, solid, defiant, and impossibly whole. A massive stone chimney rose from the wreckage. It was built from large, dark river stones, mortared together with a craftsman's care, and it soared 2 stories high, a grim, lonely tower against the sky. It had withstood the fire that had consumed everything else, its stones blackened but unbroken. It stood there like a tombstone, a final, stoic monument marking the grave of the family and the life that had been extinguished here. Its permanence was an insult, a mocking contrast to the fragile, transient nature of her own hopes. Helen stared at it, a coldness spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the damp air. The chimney seemed to watch her, a silent, stony witness to her utter and complete failure. It was the anchor point of her new rock bottom. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her towards the ruin. She had to see, she had to know the full extent of her mistake. She stepped cautiously through a gaping hole that might have once been a front door. Her sneakers crunched on a floor of broken glass, charred splinters, and damp ash. Inside, the devastation was even more absolute. A steady, rhythmic drip of water echoed from a dangling, half-burnt beam above, each drop landing in a dark puddle with a hollow plink. The sound was maddening, a tiny, each persistent drumbeat counting out her failure. The smell of mold was overpowering in the enclosed space. She could feel the dampness seeping into her clothes, into her very bones. This place was actively decaying, being reclaimed by the wilderness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her chest. This was not a shelter. It was a trap. Luke followed her in, his small footsteps nearly silent in the ash. He stayed close, his hand still clutching hers, his body trembling slightly. He stared around at the skeletal remains, at the gaping hole where the roof should be, at the water dripping into the dark puddles on the floor. For a long time, he was silent, absorbing the horror with the quiet solemnity of a child trying to be brave for his mother. Then he looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. His voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper, a fragile thing in the vast, crushing silence of the ruin. "Mom," he said, his lower lip trembling. This isn't our house, is it?" The simple, innocent question shattered the last of Helen's composure. It was a direct hit, a clean shot to the heart. All the strength she had been feigning, all the bravery she had been projecting for his sake, disintegrated. The dam broke. A tidal wave of grief, fear, and utter despair she had been holding back for so long finally overwhelmed her. Hot, silent tears began to stream down her face, blurring the awful scene before her. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the cold, wet ash, the rough texture grinding into her jeans. She had nothing left. No money, no home, no plan, no hope. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in a rotting, burnt-out shell, with a wilderness full of unknown dangers pressing in on all sides. The full catastrophic weight of her foolish, desperate gamble crashed down upon her, crushing her. A sob, raw and guttural, tore itself from her throat, the sound of a soul breaking. It echoed horribly in the skeletal remains of the house, a desolate cry swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the woods. She had led her son to the end of the world, and there was nothing here. Days bled into a week, a miserable blur of damp cold and gnawing hunger. The ruin did not become a home. It remained a wound, and they were living inside it. Helen and Luke had cleared a small corner within the skeletal walls, using a large piece of corrugated metal scavenged from the debris as a makeshift roof against the incessant drizzle. It was a pathetic shelter, but it was theirs. The nights were the worst. The temperature plummeted, and the thin blankets they owned were no match for the damp, penetrating chill that rose from the earth. Helen would lie awake for hours, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water and the rustle of unseen things in the darkness beyond their flimsy walls. She felt her body growing weaker, her spirit fraying with each passing day. The despair she'd felt upon arrival had cooled into a hard, grim determination. They would survive this. She didn't know how, but she refused to let the ruin be their tomb. She just had to find a way, anyway, to fight back against the cold. The great stone chimney became the center of their meager existence. It was the only part of the structure that felt solid, the only thing that promised any defense against the encroaching wilderness. During the day, Helen and Luke gathered fallen branches from the surrounding woods, their hands growing scraped and raw from the work. They stacked the wood inside the massive, soot-blackened maw of the fireplace, a desperate offering to the god of warmth. Helen's heart felt heavy with a bleak irony. She, a seamstress whose life had been about creation and delicate work, was now a forager, a cave woman, her hands covered in dirt and splinters instead of thread and fabric. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. But the cold was a more immediate enemy. It sapped their strength, stole their will, and made every thought sluggish. A fire was not a luxury. It was the only thing that could keep them alive through another night of this waking nightmare. Her every muscle ached with the effort of their survival. That evening, as a bruised purple twilight bled across the sky, a biting wind began to howl through the gaps in the ruined walls. The sound was like a predator circling their camp, a hungry moan that made the hair on Helen's arms stand on end. Luke was huddled in the blankets, shivering uncontrollably, his face pale and his lips tinged with blue. A primal fear, sharp and cold as ice, pierced Helen's heart. She had to get a fire going. Now, kneeling on the cold stone hearth, she arranged the driest sticks into a small pile. Her hands trembled, partly from the cold, partly from a gnawing anxiety. What if it didn't light? What if the wood was too damp? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She worked methodically, her breath misting in the frigid air, her focus narrowed to this single, critical task. The world had shrunk to this fireplace, this pile of wood, and the desperate hope for a single, life-giving flame. The oppressive silence of the ruin pressed in on her, amplifying the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. She struck one of her few remaining matches. The tiny flame sputtered, a fragile speck of orange in the vast gloom. Helen cupped her hands around it, shielding it from the drafts, her entire being focused on nurturing this tiny spark. She held it to the tinder. It caught. A small, hungry flame began to lick at the wood, and for the first time in days, a flicker of genuine warmth touched her skin. A sigh of relief escaped her lips, a sound that was half a sob. As the fire grew, pushing back the oppressive darkness and the soul-crushing cold, she leaned back against the interior wall of the fireplace, trying to absorb every bit of heat. Luke crawled out of the blankets and huddled beside her, his shivering slowly subsiding as the welcome warmth seeped into his small body. The firelight danced across the soot-stained stones, casting long, wavering shadows that made the ruin seem even more cavernous and menacing. But here, in this small circle of light, they were safe, if only for a little while. It was in that moment, as her eyes adjusted to the flickering light, that she noticed it. At her eye level, on the interior wall of the chimney, one of the stones was different. While all the others were uniformly coated in a thick, uniform layer of black soot from decades of fires, this one was cleaner along its edges. The mortar around it seemed less stable, and the stone itself, a smooth, grey river rock about the size of a loaf of bread, didn't seem to be covered in the same deep, ingrained grime as its neighbours. It was subtle, something you would only notice if you were staring intently, seeking warmth from the very stones themselves. A strange feeling, a faint prickle of curiosity, broke through her exhaustion. It looked as if it had been moved, not a long time ago, but recently enough to disturb the ancient blanket of soot. Her brow furrowed. Why would one stone be different? Her mind, desperate for any puzzle other than their own survival, latched onto the anomaly. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers tracing the outline of the stone. It felt cool to the touch, despite the growing fire just a few feet away. She pushed against it gently. It wiggled, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was there. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. It was loose. The other stones were a solid, immovable mass. But this one shifted under the pressure of her hand. An electric thrill, a bizarre mix of fear and excitement, shot through her. What was this? Why was this stone loose? She glanced at Luke, who was now dozing, his head resting on her lap. His face finally relaxed in the fire's warmth. He was safe for the moment. The wind howled outside, but in here the fire crackled, a cheerful, defiant sound. Helen turned her attention back to the stone. The mystery of it was a hook, pulling her in, offering a distraction from the crushing reality of their situation. The simple question, why, echoed in the silence of her mind. Using the tips of her raw, chapped fingers, she began to work at the edges of the stone, digging into the crumbling mortar. The grit ground under her fingernails, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her focus was absolute. The stone was heavy and wedged in tight. She strained, her muscles protesting, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a moment she thought it was impossible, that her tired mind was playing tricks on her, but then, with a low grinding scrape of stone against stone, it began to give way. The sound was loud in the quiet ruin, and she froze, her heart hammering. She looked around, half expecting to see something or someone in the shadows, disturbed by the noise, but there was only the fire, the wind, and the sleeping form of her son. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she renewed her efforts, pulling and wiggling the stone with a desperate strength born of pure adrenaline. She had to know what was behind it. With a final, grating groan, the stone came free. It was heavier than she expected, and she almost dropped it, catching it just before it hit the hearth. She set it down gently, her hands trembling with exertion and anticipation. Where the stone had been, there was now a hole, a perfect dark rectangular cavity, blacker than the soot-stained walls around it. It was a deliberate space, an emptiness that had been carefully planned and hidden within the chimney's massive structure. A puff of cold, stale air, smelling of dust and long-forgotten secrets, wafted out from the opening, chilling her face. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, snaked its way down her spine. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't an accident of construction. This was a hiding place. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of impossible, frantic thoughts. What could be so important that someone would build a secret compartment in a chimney to hide it? The firelight didn't penetrate the darkness within. It was an abyss. Her hand went instinctively to the cheap flashlight she kept in her coat pocket, her one reliable tool in this world of decay. Her fingers felt clumsy as she clicked it on. The beam of light was weak, but it cut a sharp white circle into the oppressive darkness of the ruin. Taking another shaky breath to steady her nerves, she aimed the light into the hole. The beam illuminated a small, brick-lined chamber, about 2 feet deep, and inside, sitting squarely in the middle of the space, was a box. It was a metal box, dark and squat, its surface obscured by a thick, orange-brown crust of rust. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it looked heavy, dense, and ancient. It sat there in the silence, an object out of time, a question mark made of corroded metal. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the frantic pulse in her throat. Her mouth had gone completely dry. For a moment, she could only stare, caught between the urge to slam the stone back into place and an overpowering need to know what was inside. She had to reach deep into the cavity to get it. The rough bricks scraped her arm as she stretched, her fingers finally making contact with the cold, gritty surface of the box. It was even heavier than it looked. Grunting with the effort, she dragged it forward, the metal bottom scraping loudly against the brick. She pulled it out of the hole and set it on the hearth beside her, between her and the fire. The box was sealed shut with rust, a simple clasp fused into a solid mass. There was no keyhole. She turned it over in her hands. It felt solid, impenetrable. A wave of frustration washed over her. To come this far, to find this secret, only to be stopped by a lump of rust. No, she refused. She looked around the debris-strewn floor, and her eyes landed on a heavy, sharp-edged piece of metal, part of a broken fireplace tool. It would have to do. Her mind was a singular point of focus. Open the box. With the makeshift crowbar in hand, she wedged its sharp end into the seam of the box's lid. She put her weight into it, gritting her teeth. The rust fought back, stubborn and unyielding. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the soot that smeared her face. She pushed harder, a low groan escaping her lips. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, violent crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent ruin, the rust-welded seal broke. The lid sprang open a few inches with a protesting squeal of metal. Helen dropped the tool, her heart leaping into her throat. She stared at the gap in the lid, her breath held tight in her chest. The moment felt surreal, stretched thin and fragile. Whatever was inside had been waiting in the dark for years, maybe decades, and she was about to be the first person to see it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the lid, her mind a complete blank, void of all expectation. This was it. She lifted the lid. The interior of the box was lined with what looked like old rotting velvet, now mostly disintegrated into a dark powder, and resting on that bed of decay was a pile of rocks. For a single, crushing moment, a bitter disappointment washed over her. Just rocks. All that effort, all that mystery, for a box of worthless stones. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. Of course, it was the perfect, cruel punchline to the cosmic joke her life had become. But then the firelight caught them, and they didn't just reflect the light. They drank it in and threw it back, exploding into 1,000 tiny, brilliant points of white and blue and gold. Her breath hitched in her throat. The laugh died before it was born. They weren't rocks. She reached in with a trembling finger and touched the surface of the largest one. It was rough, uncut, and cold to the touch, but it glittered with an impossible internal fire. They were diamonds, raw, uncut diamonds. Disbelief was a physical force, a wave that washed over her, making her feel dizzy and disconnected from her own body. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and cold and despair. She picked one up. It was heavy in her palm, its sharp, crystalline edges digging into her skin. It felt real. In the wavering firelight, it shone with a cold, hard brilliance that was more real than anything she had experienced in months. Dozens of them. There were dozens of them, ranging in size from a pebble to a robin's egg. A fortune. A life-changing, world-altering fortune, sitting in a rusty metal box on the floor of a burnt-out house in the middle of nowhere. Tears sprang to her eyes, but these were not the hot tears of grief or despair. They were tears of pure, unadulterated shock. Her mind simply couldn't process it. The chasm between the abject poverty of her mourning and the impossible wealth in her hands now was too vast to comprehend. She let the diamond drop from her fingers. It landed on the pile with a soft, satisfying clink, a sound of incredible density and value. It was the sound of a new life, the sound of a real house, of food, of a future for Luke. Her gaze fell back into the box, and she saw that there was something else tucked beneath the glittering pile of stones. It was a book, small, bound in dark leather that was cracked and dry with age, its cover warped from time. It was nestled securely at the bottom, protected by the velvet lining and the weight of the diamonds above it. Her heart, which had just begun to slow its frantic rhythm, started pounding again, but for a different reason. The diamonds were wealth, but this felt different. This felt like a story. The true secret wasn't just the treasure, it was the history that came with it. The real discovery lay waiting between the covers of this old, forgotten book. With a reverence she didn't know she possessed, Helen lifted the remaining diamonds out of the box, placing them carefully on a piece of cloth beside her. They sparkled like a handful of captured stars against the drab fabric. Then she reached in and carefully lifted out the journal. It felt fragile in her hands, the leather dry and brittle, threatening to crumble. The air filled with the faint, dusty scent of old paper and leather, the smell of a library, the smell of time itself. There were no markings on the cover. It was completely anonymous. This wasn't just an object, it was a voice from the past, a message left behind in the dark. The questions that had been swirling in her mind about the diamonds, who they belonged to, why they were hidden, now focused with laser intensity on the book in her hands. Here, she sensed, were the answers. Here was the truth behind the fire, the ruin, and the impossible treasure. She ran her thumb over the yellowed, gilt-edged pages. They were so dry they felt like they could turn to dust at her touch. She opened it to the first page. The inside cover was blank, but the first page was filled with elegant, looping handwriting. The ink faded from a deep black to a rusty brown. At the top of the page, in a slightly larger script, was a name, Benjamin Reed. Below it, a date from the early 1980s. A name. The ghost in the ruin now had a name. Benjamin Reed. A shiver went through Helen as she stared at the name. This was his house, his chimney, his secret. She felt like an intruder, a grave robber who had stumbled upon something deeply personal and sacred. The feeling of trespassing was so strong, she almost closed the book and put it back. But the need to understand, to know the story of this place that was now inextricably linked with her own, was stronger. She had to know who Benjamin Reed was. Flipping gently through the pages, she saw that it was a journal, a ledger of some kind. It was filled with dates, names, numbers, and short, cryptic notes. The handwriting was neat and precise, the writing of a careful, methodical man. Her eyes scanned the entries, not understanding most of them, but catching words that sent a chill down her spine, words like syndicate, extraction, payment, and, repeated several times, the river of tears. It was clear this was not a simple personal diary. This was a record of business, but the tone of the later entries felt different. The handwriting grew more hurried, more frantic. The neat script became a desperate scrawl. She could feel the author's growing anxiety bleeding through the ink and into the very paper itself. This journal didn't just contain facts. It contained a man's fear. It was the story of something going terribly, terribly wrong. Her attention was drawn back to the box, the diamonds, the journal. This was a treasure, but it was also evidence. A profound and unsettling realization began to dawn on Helen. The fire that had destroyed this house, the fire that had created the ruin she now inhabited, was no accident. A fire like that, an inferno that could gut a house but leave a stone chimney standing, was not random. It was deliberate. It was meant to destroy something, or someone. It was meant to silence Benjamin Reed and bury this box forever. The cold dread that had been a constant companion for weeks returned with a vengeance, colder and sharper than ever. She wasn't just a destitute widow who had stumbled upon a fortune. She had stumbled into the middle of a dark, violent story that was clearly not over. The secret she had unearthed was not just old, it felt dangerous. She looked over at Luke, who was sleeping soundly, his face angelic in the firelight, completely oblivious to the earth-shattering secret she had just uncovered. A fierce, protective instinct, more powerful than any fear, surged through her. This treasure, this story, it was his future, but it was also a threat. The people who had set the fire, the people Benjamin Reed was so afraid of, what would they do if they knew that the property had been sold? What would they do if they knew that a desperate woman and her son were now living in the ruins, sleeping beside the very chimney where the secret was hidden? The thought was a jolt of pure ice in her veins. She had thought the wilderness was her enemy, the cold her biggest threat, but she was wrong. The real danger wasn't the elements, it was people, and they had no idea she was here, or did they? The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks onto the hearth. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the makeshift roof over their heads. But the sounds of the storm were no longer the most frightening thing in Helen's world. She held the heavy, leather-bound journal in her lap, its weight feeling immense, significant. It was a key. It was a map. It was a weapon. She didn't know it yet, but the journal held the power to unravel a dark history that had poisoned this land for decades. It held the names of victims and the names of monsters, and by finding it, Helen had just painted a target on her own back. The mystery of the loose stone was solved, but it had unlocked a door to a far larger, far more terrifying mystery. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was now the guardian of a dead man's secret, and she had a terrifying premonition that the ghosts of this place were far from at rest. She carefully placed the journal back into the metal box, nestling it beside the impossible pile of diamonds. The weight of it all, the wealth, the danger, the responsibility, settled upon her shoulders. This was too big for her. She was just a seamstress, a widow, a mother trying to keep her son warm. How could she possibly navigate this? Her first instinct was to run, take the box, take her son and disappear, drive until they ran out of road and start a new life where no one could ever find them. But where would they go? And what about Benjamin Reed? What about the story he had died to protect? Leaving felt like a betrayal, like leaving a man to die all over again. She felt trapped, caught between a dangerous past and an uncertain future. The ruin around her was no longer just a symbol of her failure. It was now the heart of a conspiracy. With trembling hands, she closed the lid of the metal box. The soft click of the clasp sounded like a gavel falling, a final judgment. Her fate, and Luke's, was now sealed inside this rusty container. She looked at the hole in the chimney wall, the dark cavity that had coughed up this terrible, wonderful secret. For a moment, she considered putting the box back, replacing the stone and pretending none of this had ever happened. She could try to forget the glitter of the diamonds, the weight of the journal. She could go back to the simple, desperate fight for survival against the cold and hunger. It was a tempting thought, a simpler fear, but she knew it was impossible. She couldn't unsee what she had seen. She couldn't unknow what she now held in her hands. The innocence of her despair was gone, replaced by the heavy burden of knowledge. She hid the box, not back in the chimney, that felt too obvious now, but deep within their meager pile of belongings, wrapped in her late husband's old work coat and buried at the bottom of a duffel bag. It felt inadequate, a flimsy hiding place for a secret so massive. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig in the woods outside, now sounded like a footstep. The paranoia was a living thing, coiling in her gut. She felt watched. The feeling was so intense, so real, that she found herself scanning the dark tree line, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was holding a fortune that could solve all her problems, but it felt more like a curse, a ticking bomb that had just been armed. The fire was beginning to die down, its comforting light shrinking, and the shadows in the ruin grew longer, darker, and more menacing than before. Luke stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Helen gently stroked his hair, her hand shaking. Her love for him was a fierce, burning ache in her chest, and it sharpened her fear into a fine, sharp point. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had to protect him. This secret, this danger, she had brought it to their doorstep. The weight of that responsibility was suffocating. She felt an overwhelming urge to wake him, to bundle him into the truck and just drive anywhere. But the truck was nearly out of gas, and her $500 were gone, transformed into this deed for a haunted piece of land. They were trapped here, in the very epicenter of the danger. A cold, hard knot of resolve formed in her stomach. She couldn't run, so she would have to understand, she would have to read the journal. She had to know exactly what kind of monster she was up against. As the last embers of the fire glowed like angry red eyes in the darkness, Helen made a decision. Tomorrow she would read. She would decipher Benjamin Reed's story page by page. She would learn the names, the dates, and the crimes. The fear was still there, a cold poison in her veins, but it was now mixed with something else, a grim, steely anger, an anger on behalf of the man who wrote the journal, a man murdered and silenced, an anger for herself and her son, thrown into this nest of secrets and lies. The ruin was no longer just a shelter. It was a battleground, and the journal in her bag was the only weapon she had. As she finally drifted into an uneasy, dream-filled sleep, she clutched the flashlight in her hand like a talisman, ready for the darkness she knew was coming. Both inside the pages of the book and in the woods beyond, the mystery had been found, and her life would never, ever be the same. The next morning, the sun did little to warm the damp, cold air that clung to the ruin. A miserable drizzle had started, tapping a mournful rhythm on their makeshift metal roof. Helen sat huddled near the cold fireplace, the rusty box in her lap, its weight a terrifying comfort. The diamonds were a distant, unbelievable dream, but the journal felt immediate and real. Its leather cover was cool and brittle beneath her fingers. She felt a profound sense of trespassing, of prying into a story that had ended in fire and death. But the need to understand was a physical ache, a gnawing hunger for the truth. This place, this symbol of her absolute failure, was now the epicenter of a secret she had to unravel, not just for herself, but for Luke, who played quietly nearby, arranging smooth stones into a small wall, oblivious to the fact that their world had fractured overnight. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread as she took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of wet ash, and opened the book. The first page bore the name Benjamin Reed and a date from 1981. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was that of a careful man, an accountant or a clerk. Helen's fingers, raw and chapped from gathering wood, trembled as she turned the fragile, yellowed pages. The initial entries were mundane, detailing prospecting finds and supply costs, but the tone began to shift. A new name appeared frequently, always with a sense of gravity: Warren Caldwell. Then came the first mention of the syndicate, and a chilling phrase: clearing the river of tears. The journal was not a diary, it was a ledger of crimes. Helen felt a cold sweat prickle her hairline. The book in her hands was not just a story, it was a record of systematic theft and cruelty, and she was sitting in the very heart of it. The wind whistled through a crack in the chimney, sounding like a low, mournful whisper, and a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The ruin suddenly felt less empty, as if haunted by the ghosts of the names on the pages. She read on, her eyes scanning the neat columns of names and figures, each entry a small tragedy. June 4th, 1982, one entry read, took the claim from the old man, Henderson. He had a good seam. Caldwell's boys scared him off his land, said his deed was improperly filed. I had to draft the new paperwork. My hand shook the whole time. The look in that old man's eyes, and he had a daughter, same age as my Sarah. Helen's heart clenched. She could feel Benjamin's anguish seeping through the faded ink. This was a man trapped, forced to be the architect of other people's ruin, a feeling she understood all too well. The syndicate wasn't just robbing people, they were erasing them, using the law as a weapon to steal the land from under the feet of honest miners who had worked it for generations. The name Warren Caldwell was at the center of it all, a spider in a web of deceit and violence, pulling the strings while men like Benjamin were forced to do the dirty work. She felt a surge of sickness in the pit of her stomach. Another entry, a few pages later, was more direct, more horrifying. September 19th, 1982. Miller is gone. He found a pocket of high-quality stones near the waterfall and refused to sell to Caldwell. They found his truck at the bottom of the ravine this morning. Brake failure, they said. Everyone knows it's a lie. I saw Miller yesterday. He'd just had his brakes serviced. I saw Caldwell at the diner afterwards. He was eating pie, smiling. He looked right at me and said, "Accidents happen, Ben, especially on these mountain roads." It wasn't a comment. It was a threat. And a confession. Helen had to close her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. The casual brutality of it stole her breath. This wasn't just theft. It was murder, cold and calculated, served up with a slice of pie. She looked out at the oppressive, silent woods surrounding her, and for the first time, she felt the true menace of the place. It wasn't the wilderness that was dangerous. It was the man who believed he owned it. As she delved deeper into the journal, the full scope of Warren Caldwell's evil became terrifyingly clear. He was the king of this forgotten corner of the world, a feudal lord ruling through fear. Benjamin's ledger meticulously detailed how Caldwell's syndicate had systematically intimidated, bankrupted, and murdered dozens of independent prospectors over the years. They would identify a rich claim, fabricate a legal challenge, and then use violence to drive the rightful owners away, seizing their land and their discoveries. The journal was the proof. It was a detailed, damning indictment, listing the names of the victims, the dates of the crimes, and the amounts stolen. Helen felt the weight of the book in her hands increase with every page. This wasn't just Benjamin Reed's story. It was the story of all the lost souls of Harmony Creek, all the men whose dreams had been turned to dust by Caldwell's greed. The name Warren Caldwell was no longer just a name. It was the signature on a death warrant. The later entries were filled with a palpable sense of self-loathing and regret. Benjamin's neat script grew unsteady, the lines of ink thicker, as if pressed by a hand heavy with guilt. October 30th, 1983, I am a monster, he wrote. I am a coward who holds the pen while other men hold the guns. I record their stolen treasures and tally the profits from their blood. I see the faces of the men we've ruined in my sleep, their wives, their children. I look at my own hands and see the stains. God forgive me, what have I become? I write their names here in this book. Henderson, Miller, Chavez, Dubois. I write them so they are not forgotten. It is the only penance I can offer. Helen felt tears well in her eyes, blurring the page. A profound empathy for this long-dead stranger washed over her. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake and was desperately trying to find a way to atone for it before it was too late. He was just like her, trapped and looking for a way out. The plan was laid out in the journal's final pages. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble. Benjamin had been skimming from Caldwell for months, not cash, but the best of the uncut diamonds that passed through his hands, replacing them with lower-grade stones. He was building a secret fund. He wrote of his intention to take his ledger, the journal she now held, and the stolen diamonds and flee. He wasn't escaping for riches, but for redemption. He planned to deliver the journal and the stones to the federal authorities as irrefutable proof of Caldwell's crimes, using the diamonds as restitution for the families of the victims. It is their blood money, he wrote. It must be returned. This journal is their justice. It is my only confession and my only testament. If I do not survive, may whoever finds this know the truth of the river of tears. The treasure wasn't a treasure. It was evidence. It was a weapon, and it was now in her hands. The final entry was a panicked scrawl, the words barely legible, crashing into each other across the page. March 12, 1984. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows I have the ledger. I saw his trucks on the old road at dusk. They are coming for me. There is no time to run. I have hidden the box. The chimney is strong, built by my grandfather. The fire will not touch it. They will not find it. God help me. They are here. The entry ended there, a frantic, jagged line trailing off the page as if the pen had been ripped from his hand. Helen stared at the final words, her blood running cold. She could almost hear it, the rumble of the trucks, the splintering of the door, the shouts in the night. The fire that had destroyed this house wasn't an accident, it was an execution. It was the final brutal act of silencing the one man who could bring Warren Caldwell down, and he had failed. Until now. The silence of the ruin was suddenly filled with the echoes of that terrible night. Just as the chilling realization settled in her bones, a sound cut through the morning drizzle. It was a sound that didn't belong here. In this world of rot and decay, it was the low, powerful rumble of a modern engine, smooth and confident. Helen's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled to her feet, her movements frantic, clumsy. The truck. She had to hide the box. The sound was getting closer, coming up the overgrown track that led to the clearing. She shoved the journal back into the rusty box, the diamonds clinking softly, a sound of sickening value. She didn't have time to put it back in the duffel bag. Her eyes darted around the ruin, desperate, the fireplace. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for the pile of firewood they had gathered and frantically buried the box beneath the damp logs and branches. She stood up just as a gleaming, dark green pickup truck, impossibly clean, rolled into the clearing and stopped. The driver's side door opened with a quiet, expensive-sounding click. A man stepped out. He was tall, and though he looked to be in his 70s, he stood with the straight-backed posture of a man accustomed to authority. He wore immaculate leather boots that seemed to sneer at the mud and ash on the ground. His clothes were simple but expensive. A pressed flannel shirt and clean, dark jeans. A pristine Stetson hat sat on his head, shielding his face from the light rain. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, each footfall on the soggy ground sounding like a judgment. He stopped a few feet away, pushing the brim of his hat up slightly. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes were a pale, piercing blue, as cold and hard as the diamonds hidden in the fireplace. A slow, thin smile spread across his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Helen's stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, who this was. "Well now," the man said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that oozed false charm. He surveyed the ruin, his gaze lingering on the pathetic makeshift shelter she and Luke had built. His eyes then settled on Helen, and then on Luke, who had stopped playing and was now standing half-hidden behind her, clutching her jeans. "This is quite a surprise. Didn't expect to find anyone out here, especially not a lady and her boy." He tipped his hat. "Warren Caldwell," he said, introducing himself as if the name were a title. "My ranch borders this property. I knew the folks who lived here before. A real tragedy, that fire." He said the word, tragedy, with a chilling lack of emotion, his cold blue eyes never leaving hers. Helen felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. She was face to face with the monster from the journal, and he was smiling at her. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab Luke and flee, but her feet felt rooted to the ashen ground. Caldwell continued, his tone deceptively neighborly. "Look, I'll be direct. This place is an eyesore, and, frankly, it's dangerous. I've been trying to buy this plot for years, just to clean it up and absorb it into my grazing land. It's no place for a family." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. "I'll give you $1,000 for it. That's double what you could have possibly paid for this wreck. You can take your son. Find a decent place in town. It's a generous offer." He clicked the pen, the sound sharp and final in the quiet clearing. $1,000. The offer was an insult, a clear message that he thought she was worthless, desperate, and stupid. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she was just some vagrant, or if she knew. Helen's mind raced. The box, full of millions, was mere feet away from him. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard, she thought he must be able to see it pounding through her thin coat. She had to force the words out, her throat tight and dry. "No," she said. Her voice was a weak, trembling whisper, but it was a no. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Caldwell, but we're going to stay." She tried for a defiant tone, but fear made it reedy. "It's all we have. We're going to try and make it a home." She could feel Luke trembling behind her leg. She placed a hand on his head, a gesture that was as much for her own reassurance as it was for his. Caldwell's smile didn't falter, but a subtle, dangerous shift occurred in his cold eyes. The pretense of the friendly rancher was thinning, revealing the predator beneath. He slowly put his checkbook back in his pocket, his movements deliberate, menacing. The air grew thick with unspoken threat. The drizzle continued to fall, each drop feeling like a countdown timer to something terrible. She had just challenged the king in his own kingdom, and she had no idea what his response would be. The folksy charm vanished from his voice, replaced by a low, chilling tone that was as sharp as broken glass. "A home?" he repeated softly, a humorless chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Ma'am, this isn't a home. This is a grave. You're living in a dead man's grave." He took a step closer, and Helen instinctively pulled Luke tighter against her. "This is a very isolated place," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Things happen out here. The fire that took poor Benjamin, terrible accident. People get lost in these woods. Snakes, bears, and other, more unpredictable dangers." His gaze flickered meaningfully towards Luke, a silent, venomous threat that made Helen's blood run cold. "It's no place to raise a child alone. A smart woman would take the money and leave. A smart woman knows when she's in over her head." His eyes held hers, and in their icy depths, she saw the same ruthless finality Benjamin must have seen on the night of the fire. He let the threat hang in the damp air for a long moment before turning away. "Think about my offer," he said over his shoulder as he walked back to his gleaming truck. "It won't stand forever." The door clicked shut, the powerful engine roared to life, and with a spray of mud from its tires, the truck disappeared back down the track, leaving behind only the oppressive silence and the lingering smell of exhaust. Helen stood frozen, her body trembling uncontrollably, her arm wrapped around her son. The monster was real, and now he knew they were here. He hadn't just made an offer, he had delivered a warning, an ultimatum. The secret in the fireplace was no longer a path to a new life. It was a death sentence. She was trapped, holding a truth that could get her and her son killed. What would you do in her place? Would you take the diamonds and run, saving yourself but burying the truth forever? Or would you stay and fight for a justice you never asked for, risking everything for a man you never knew? The roar of Caldwell's engine faded, but the sound echoed in Helen's mind, a visceral promise of violence. The silence that descended upon the clearing was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of pure terror. She stood frozen, the damp air clinging to her skin like a shroud, her arm a vice around Luke's small shoulders. He whimpered, burying his face in her coat. Caldwell's words, "This is a dead man's grave," slithered in her ears. He hadn't just threatened them. He had laid claim to their lives. The cold, piercing blue of his eyes was burned into her memory, the eyes of a predator that had just scented blood. Her own. A wave of nausea, acrid and hot, rose in her throat. She felt a primal, animalistic fear that she had never known, a certainty that if they stayed here another night, they would be swallowed by the dark history of this place. The ruin was no longer a shelter. It was a tombstone, and Caldwell had just chiseled their names onto it. The time for desperation was over. This was a fight for their very lives. Her body finally unlocked from its paralysis, propelled by a surge of pure adrenaline. "Pack your bag, Luke," she ordered, her voice a harsh, strained whisper she barely recognized as her own. She could not let her son see the terror that was threatening to tear her apart. Her hands shook violently as she scrambled towards their pathetic shelter. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch in the wind, was the sound of Caldwell's return. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner desperate for escape. She ripped the makeshift roof aside and began throwing their few belongings, the thin blankets, a change of clothes, the last of their food, into a worn canvas bag. Her movements were frantic, inefficient. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was prey. The feeling was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. The illusion of safety she had tried to build here had been utterly shattered, replaced by the stark and terrifying reality of their situation. They had to run. Now. The metal box. The thought slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. She lunged towards the fireplace, her fingers clawing at the pile of damp wood she had so carefully stacked. The logs were heavy, slippery with moss, and she scraped her knuckles raw, pulling them away. There it was. The rusty container sat in the ashes, a dark, malevolent heart in the corpse of the house. She seized it, the cold metal shocking her skin. It was impossibly heavy, its weight a dense concentration of both hope and damnation. A future for Luke and a death sentence were locked together inside. For a delirious moment, she wanted to hurl it into the woods, to rid herself of its terrible burden, but she couldn't. The journal inside was Benjamin Reed's only testament, the only weapon against a man who ruled with murder and fear. Taking it was a risk, but leaving it was a betrayal she could not stomach. She shoved the box into the bottom of the canvas bag, hiding it beneath their worn clothes, a secret that pulsed with lethal energy. Where could they go? The question screamed in her mind, a frantic, looping panic. The gas tank in the truck was almost empty, barely enough to get them back to Harmony Creek, a town that was undoubtedly in Caldwell's pocket. He would find them there in an hour. Her eyes fell on the crudely drawn map Silas had given her, which she'd left on the truck's dashboard. She remembered a faint, secondary track branching off, leading to another small square marked S. Miller, a neighbor. It was miles away, a desperate gamble into an unknown wilderness, but it was the only direction that wasn't back towards the spider's web. It was a choice between a certain trap and a sliver of a chance. A cold resolve hardened in her gut. She would not let Caldwell corner them. She would not be the next accident on a mountain road. She would take the one path he wouldn't expect. She grabbed Luke's hand, his small fingers cold and trembling in hers. His terrified eyes searched her face for an explanation she couldn't give. "We're going on another walk, sweetie," she said, her voice cracking as she tried to force a reassuring smile. The lie was a bitter acid in her throat. This was not an adventure, this was a flight. She bundled him into the passenger seat of the old pickup, the cold vinyl a familiar, unwelcome sensation. The cab was filled with the metallic scent of her own fear. She threw their single bag into the back and climbed behind the wheel, her body trembling so hard she could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally caught the sound a ragged, defiant roar in the charged silence. She didn't dare turn on the headlights, using only the faint grey light of the dying afternoon to navigate the treacherous, muddy track. Each lurch of the truck, each scrape of a branch against the window, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her veins. She felt exposed. a slow-moving target in a shooting gallery owned by a killer. Her eyes were fixed on the gas gauge, its needle hovering precariously over empty. The drive was a waking nightmare. Helen's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her entire body rigid with tension. The overgrown track was a tunnel of oppressive green, the trees pressing in, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the truck. She kept her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gleaming grille of Caldwell's truck roaring up behind them. The forest was alive with sounds she had previously ignored, the sharp cry of a hawk, the rustle of an unseen animal in the undergrowth, and each one was a potential threat. The world outside the grimy windows was no longer just wilderness. It was enemy territory. A profound sense of isolation descended on her, even more complete than before. Out here, their screams would be swallowed by the trees. There was no one to help, no one to hear them. The only sound was the sputtering protest of her truck's engine, a dying heartbeat counting down their final moments of escape. The knot of fear in her stomach was a cold, hard stone. She found the turnoff more by instinct than by sight. It was barely a path, two faint ruts disappearing into an even denser, darker part of the woods. It was a path that screamed, "Turn back," but it was the one marked on the map. She took a deep, shaky breath and wrenched the wheel, the truck groaning as it lurched onto the new track. Immediately, the canopy of leaves overhead became thicker, plunging them into a deep, gloomy twilight. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of pine and decay. It felt as if they were driving into the earth's throat. The path was steep and slick with mud, and the old tires struggled for purchase, whining and spinning. Helen fought the wheel, her muscles aching with the strain, her heart pounding in her ears. She was flying blind, fueled by nothing but terror and a sliver of hope that this path led to a person, any person, who was not Warren Caldwell. She felt a tear of pure desperation slide down her cheek, hot against her cold skin. The truck was losing power, the engine's coughs growing weaker. With a final, pathetic shudder, the engine died. The truck coughed, sputtered, and then fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was deafening, a crushing weight. They coasted for a few yards before rolling to a stop, the front bumper nosing into a muddy ditch. They were stranded. The silence rushed in to fill the cab, thick and watchful. Helen rested her forehead against the steering wheel, a single, choked sob escaping her lips. This was it, the end of the line. They were trapped in the middle of nowhere, with the woods growing darker by the minute. Luke, who had been silent, reached over and put his small hand on her arm. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling but brave. His simple act of comfort was a knife to her heart, but it was also a spark. She couldn't give up. Not while he was here, not while he still believed in her. She lifted her head, her jaw set in grim determination. "You're right. Sweetie," she said, "it's okay. We just have to walk the rest of the way." Getting out of the truck was like stepping into another world. The woods were a wall of sound and shadow. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest floor was a treacherous landscape of tangled roots and unseen holes, cloaked in a deep, blue-black darkness. Helen slung the heavy canvas bag over her shoulder, the corner of the metal box digging painfully into her back. She grabbed the flashlight, its weak beam a pathetic sword against the encroaching night. Taking Luke's hand, she started walking, following the faint ruts of the path. The air was cold and bit at her exposed skin. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep behind them. Every hoot of an owl felt like a warning. Fear was a living entity, walking beside her, whispering that they were lost, that they were being hunted. She could feel Caldwell's presence everywhere. In the darkness between the trees, in the cold wind on her neck, her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. She was just a seamstress, not a survivor, and she was terrified she was leading her son to his death. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the darkness, her legs aching and her lungs burning, she saw it, a single, faint point of yellow light, flickering weakly through the dense latticework of trees. It was so small, so fragile. It could have been a firefly, but it was steady. It was a light bulb. Hope, so sharp and fierce it was painful, surged through her, giving her a fresh burst of strength. "Look, Luke, a light," she whispered, her voice hoarse. They quickened their pace, tripping and stumbling over roots, their eyes fixed on that tiny beacon. The light grew brighter, and soon they could make out the dark, solid shape of a small cabin nestled in a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke, rich and comforting, drifted towards them on the night air. It was the smell of life, of warmth, of safety. As they broke through the tree line and into the clearing, the frantic barking of a dog erupted from the cabin, a furious territorial sound that made them both freeze in their tracks. The light in the window was snuffed out. The front door of the cabin creaked open, spilling a rectangle of dim light onto the porch. A figure was silhouetted in the doorway, a tall, wiry man holding the long, unmistakable shape of a shotgun. "That's far enough," a voice rasped, rough and gravelly with age and disuse. "State your business, or I'll have Buster here state it for you." The barking intensified, a deep-chested, menacing sound coming from the darkness beside the man. Helen's heart, which had soared with hope, plummeted back into the icy depths of fear. She instinctively pushed Luke behind her, raising her free hand in a gesture of surrender. The beam of her own flashlight shook, dancing across the ground. "Please," she called out, her voice trembling and thin in the vast night. "We're lost. Our truck broke down. My son, he's cold. We just need help." She was a pathetic sight, a mud-stained, terrified woman and a small, shivering child, and she prayed it was enough to pierce the old man's suspicion. The shotgun remained pointed directly at her chest. The old man didn't move for a long moment. He was a statue of wary mistrust. Helen could see his face now in the faint spill of light from the open door, a deeply lined landscape of a face, with a thick white beard and eyes that were narrowed and sharp, missing nothing. "Lost," he grunted, the word full of disbelief. "Ain't nobody lost on this track. This track don't go nowhere. Where you coming from?" His gaze was sharp, accusatory. The dog, a large black hound she could now see, continued its low, rumbling growl. Helen swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She had to take another gamble, another leap of faith. "The old Reed place," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The burnt-out house. We bought it." The name hung in the air between them. It was a key. She watched as a flicker of something, surprise, recognition, crossed the old man's weathered face. He still didn't lower the shotgun, but the rigid line of his shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. He was listening. The night held its breath. "The Reed place," the man repeated, his voice softer now, laced with a strange new emotion. "Someone finally bought that godforsaken land." He took a step forward onto the porch, the shotgun lowering just a few inches. He peered at her, his eyes trying to penetrate the darkness and her terror. "Why in God's name would you do that?" Before she could answer, she blurted out the name that was burning a hole in her mind. "We had a visitor," she said, her voice cracking. "A man. He wanted to buy the land from us. He said his name was Warren Caldwell." The effect was instantaneous and electric. The old man froze. The name landed like a stone in a silent pool. The suspicion in his eyes was instantly replaced by something else, something harder and darker, a look of grim, ancient understanding. He let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white in the cold air. Without another word, he lowered the shotgun completely, resting its stock on the porch floor. "Buster, quiet," he commanded. The dog fell silent. "Get inside," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Stepping into the cabin was like stepping into another century. The air inside was warm and thick, with the comforting sense of pine, coffee, and old books. A fire crackled merrily in a small pot-bellied stove, its orange light casting a soft, welcoming glow over the single room. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with books, and the furniture was simple, handmade, and worn smooth with time. It was a haven, a fortress of solitude and warmth against the cold, menacing night. The old man, who introduced himself as Sam, gestured for them to sit at a small wooden table. He moved with a stiff, arthritic grace, his eyes never leaving Helen's face. He saw the mud on her clothes, the scratches on her arms, the raw terror in her eyes, and the way she clutched the heavy canvas bag to her chest as if it were a life raft. He didn't ask any more questions yet. He simply moved to the stove, poured steaming black coffee into 2 thick ceramic mugs, and placed one in front of her. The heat seeped into her frozen fingers, a small miracle of warmth and humanity. For a moment, Helen could only sit there, the warmth of the mug a shocking contrast to the ice in her veins. The safety of the small cabin was so absolute, so complete after the terror of the woods. that the dam of her composure finally broke. A choked sob escaped her, then another. The story came pouring out of her in a frantic, disjointed torrent of words. She told him everything: the eviction, the desperation, buying the ruin for her last $500. She described the cold, the hunger, and the discovery of the loose stone in the chimney. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as she described the rusty metal box, the impossible glitter of the diamonds, and the leather-bound journal. She watched his face as she spoke, and his expression grew more and more grim, his eyes darkening with a sorrowful recognition. He nodded slowly, as if she were not telling him a new story, but simply confirming an old one he had known for a very long time. The cabin was silent, save for her trembling voice and the crackle of the fire. When she finally spoke the names, Benjamin Reed and Warren Caldwell, Sam closed his eyes, a pained expression tightening the lines around his mouth. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Benjamin," he said softly, the name a ghost on his lips. "I knew it. I always knew he'd hidden it." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound sadness. "He was a good man, you know," Sam continued, his voice a low rumble. "A quiet man, good with numbers. He got caught up with the wrong people, that's all. Caldwell had a way of getting his hooks into people, twisting them until they didn't recognize themselves anymore. Ben was eaten alive by the guilt. He came to see me, a week before the fire. He was terrified, said he had to make things right." The revelation hung in the warm air of the cabin. Benjamin hadn't been alone. He had an ally, a confidant, and that ally was sitting right in front of her, pouring her a second cup of coffee with a hand that was surprisingly steady. Helen's hand shook as she reached into her bag. The other contents, the blankets, the clothes, felt like meaningless props. She pulled out the rusty metal box and placed it on the table between them. The thud of it hitting the wood was a heavy, final sound. Sam stared at it, his gaze filled with a kind of pained reverence, as if he were looking at a coffin. With trembling fingers, Helen opened the lid. The raw diamonds glittered in the lamplight. A cold and magnificent fire. Sam barely glanced at them. His eyes were fixed on the leather-bound journal nestled within. "That's it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the ledger. That's his confession, his proof." He looked at Helen, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He told me he was putting it all down. Every name, every crime. He said it was the only thing that could stop Caldwell. The only thing that could give those poor men justice." The simple cabin had become a confessional, a war room, the last bastion of a decades-old fight for the soul of the mountain. Sam leaned forward, his gnarled fingers tracing the edge of the open journal but not touching it. He seemed afraid to profane it. "Warren Caldwell didn't just build a ranch," he said, his voice low and intense. "He built an empire on the bones of his neighbors. This was a busy place, back during the mining boom, full of dreamers, men with calloused hands and hope in their hearts. Caldwell and his syndicate saw them not as people, but as obstacles. If they couldn't scare a man off his claim, they'd ruin him with lawyers. And if that didn't work—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Accidents happen," he finished, his voice dripping with bitter irony, echoing the very words from the journal. "Brake failures, hunting accidents, men just disappearing. Everyone knew who was behind it, but no one dared to speak up. Caldwell owned the sheriff, the judges, the whole town. To speak against him was to sign your own death warrant. The history of this place was not one of pioneers. It was a tale of predators and prey, and she was the one who had just disturbed the killer's den. But you knew," Helen whispered, her voice full of awe. "You knew, and you weren't afraid." Sam let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, that I was afraid. I'm not a fool, but I'm also stubborn, and I owed Ben. He was my friend." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in the quiet room. His gaze became distant, his eyes looking past Helen, back through 30 years of silence and suspicion. "That night," he began, his voice dropping even lower, "the night of the fire. It wasn't a quiet night. The wind was high, like tonight. It carries sound a long way up here on the mountain." He looked at her, his eyes sharp and clear, demanding her full attention. This was it. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the part of the story that wasn't written in the journal. "I was sitting right here in this chair, reading. The dogs were restless, growling at the door. I knew something was wrong. Something felt off in the air. He was painting a picture for her, bringing the ghost of that night into the warm, safe cabin. The air grew cold with the memory. First, I heard shouting, Sam continued, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. Angry voices, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the sound of men in a rage. I knew Ben was over there, alone. I grabbed this old shotgun, he said, patting the weapon that now leaned against the wall, and I was about to head out the door to see what was what, to help my friend. He paused, a look of profound ancient regret clouding his features, but I hesitated. I was afraid. A man alone against who knew how many, and in that moment of hesitation, I heard it. He met Helen's gaze, his own eyes dark with the memory. Two sounds, sharp, loud, crack, crack. They weren't backfires from a truck. They weren't fireworks. I've been around guns my whole life. I know a gunshot when I hear one. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. It was the confirmation she already felt in her bones. Benjamin Reed hadn't died in a fire. He had been executed in his own home. The fire was just a tool to cover up the murder. A deep, chilling silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The horror of Sam's words settled over Helen like a physical weight, stealing the air from her lungs. 2 gunshots. The final, brutal end to Benjamin Reed's story of atonement. She pictured him, his pen ripped from his hand mid-sentence, facing the men he had feared for so long. She felt a surge of cold, pure rage on his behalf. Sam's face was a mask of grief. "I should have gone over there," he whispered, his voice choked with a guilt he had clearly carried for 30 years. "Maybe I could have done something, but I was a coward. I just stood here, in the dark, and listened." He shook his head slowly, a man haunted by a single moment of inaction. A few minutes later, I heard the trucks, 2 of them. Their engines were screaming as they tore back down the track. I knew those engines. I knew the sound of Caldwell's Fords. I ran to the window and I saw their headlights cutting through the trees, heading away from Ben's place as fast as they could drive. The image was vivid, damning. "And then," Sam said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I saw the glow." He pointed out the cabin's small window, towards the direction of the ruin. It started as a faint orange flicker against the underside of the clouds, but it grew, fast. It grew into a terrible, roaring beast of a light that lit up the whole sky. The fire. They shot him, and then they burned his house to the ground to hide what they did. He looked back at Helen, his eyes blazing with an anger that had smoldered for 3 decades. I called the sheriff the next day, told him what I heard, what I saw. He wrote it down in his little notepad, promised to look into it. A week later, the official report came out. Tragic accident. Faulty wiring, case closed. Caldwell bought the sheriff a new car that Christmas. The casual corruption of it, the cold-blooded certainty of getting away with murder, made Helen feel sick. The journal in the box was not just a ledger of theft. It was the only thing that could burn down an empire of lies that had stood for a generation. Sam's story was complete. The final, missing pieces of the puzzle had been laid on the table, and the picture they formed was one of pure, unadulterated evil. Caldwell hadn't just silenced his bookkeeper, he had executed him and incinerated the evidence, or so he thought. The secret had been waiting, patiently, in its stone tomb, waiting for someone desperate enough to find it. Helen felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the terror. Her purpose, which had been so murky, was now crystal clear. This was bigger than her and Luke. It was about Benjamin. It was about Henderson and Miller and all the other forgotten names in the ledger. It was about justice, a concept she hadn't had the luxury of considering for a very long time. She owed it to Benjamin, the man who had inadvertently given her a chance at a new life, to see his final mission through. She looked from the journal to Sam's determined, grief-stricken face. They were no longer 2 strangers. They were the last 2 soldiers in Benjamin Reed's forgotten war. The quiet cabin had become a council of 2. It was the dog that broke the spell. Buster, who had been dozing by the stove, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled, and a low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest. The hair on his back stood up. He rose to his feet and padded silently to the door, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom, the growl intensifying into a menacing snarl. Sam and Helen froze, their eyes meeting in a shared moment of pure, undiluted panic. "What is it?" Helen mouthed, her voice gone. Sam put a finger to his lips, his face a mask of intense concentration. He rose from his chair, his movements silent and practiced, and grabbed the shotgun from against the wall, the metallic click of the safety being released echoing like a thunderclap in the small room. He moved to the single window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. Helen's heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. The quiet safety of the cabin had been violated. The monster was no longer a story. He was outside. Sam stared out the window for a long moment, his body rigid. He pulled back slowly, his face pale in the lamplight. His eyes were wide with a new, immediate terror. "Lights," he whispered, his voice tight and urgent. "2 trucks. They just turned off the main road onto your track." His gaze locked with Helen's, and the unspoken message was terrifyingly clear. Caldwell hadn't waited. He hadn't given her time to think about his offer. Her refusal had been her answer, and he was coming to collect his due. He wasn't coming to negotiate. He had sent his men, the same men who had likely come for Benjamin 30 years ago. They were coming to find what Benjamin had hidden, and to erase the woman and child who had found it. The past wasn't just repeating itself. It was happening all over again right now. The sense of dread was suffocating, a physical pressure in the small, warm room. They were trapped. The woods that had been her escape route were now the hunting grounds of her executioners. Panic, hot and electric, exploded in Helen's chest. She scrambled to her feet, her chair clattering loudly against the wooden floor. Luke, who had fallen asleep on a small cot in the corner, stirred at the noise. "They're going to the house," she stammered, her mind racing. "They're looking for the box." Sam shook his head grimly, his knuckles white on the stock of his shotgun. "They're not just looking, girl," he said, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Caldwell's not a man who leaves loose ends. He told you it was a grave, and he's going to make sure it is. They'll search the place, and then they'll burn everything. Your truck, your things, anything that proves you were ever there, he's erasing you." The words hit Helen with the force of a physical blow, erasing her, wiping her and her son from existence as if they were a mistake in a ledger. The sheer sociopathic ruthlessness of it was beyond comprehension. The distant rumble of engines, barely perceptible, was the sound of her own extinction approaching. "The back door," Sam commanded, his voice snapping Helen out of her frozen terror. He pointed towards a small, curtained door at the rear of the cabin. "It leads out to the woods on the far side of the clearing. There's an old logging road about a quarter-mile that way. It's overgrown, but it leads down the other side of the mountain. They won't think to look for you there." He moved towards her, grabbing the heavy canvas bag from the floor and shoving it into her arms. The weight of the box inside was a solid, terrifying reality. "Take the boy and run. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Just get to that road and follow it down. It'll eventually hit the county highway. Miles from here." He was pushing her towards the door, his urgency a palpable force. There was no time for thanks, no time for goodbyes. There was only time to run. The primal instinct to protect her child overrode every other thought, every other fear. Her only purpose on earth was to get Luke out of this forest alive. Helen moved on pure instinct. She scooped up a sleeping Luke from the cot, his small body a warm, trusting weight in her arms. He murmured in his sleep, say oblivious to the mortal danger they were in. She slung the heavy bag over her other shoulder, its strap cutting into her skin. "What about you?" she asked, her voice choked with fear for the old man who had just become her only ally. Sam gave a grim smile, hefting the shotgun. "I'm a stubborn old man who lives on a mountain. They won't be expecting me. I'll buy you some time. Now go." He pulled back the curtain, opened the door, and a blast of cold, wet air filled the room. The night was a wall of absolute blackness. He gave her a firm push. "Run!" The door clicked shut behind her, leaving her and her son alone in the pitch-dark woods, the sound of the approaching trucks growing ever louder, a harbinger of the violence that was about to be unleashed upon the mountain. She was running for their lives, propelled by a mother's terror and a dead man's hope for justice. The forest was a nightmare of unseen obstacles. Helen ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth, the strap of the heavy bag slipping from her shoulder. She adjusted it, her muscles screaming in protest. Luke was heavy in her arms, his sleepy weight a burden and a blessing, a constant, physical reminder of what she was fighting for. Sharp branches whipped at her face and arms, tearing at her clothes and skin, leaving fiery trails of pain. The cold, Wet mud sucked at her worn-out sneakers, trying to pull her down, to hold her there until the men arrived. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged, painful gasp of icy air. She stumbled over a root, falling hard to one knee, the impact jarring her teeth. Luke cried out, now fully awake and terrified. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," she sobbed, scrambling back to her feet and pulling him along by the hand. They couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. Behind them, through the trees, she could hear the sound of the truck stopping. Doors slammed. Angry voices shouted in the night. They were here, they ran. A desperate, stumbling flight through the blackness, guided only by Sam's frantic instructions. Every shadow was a man with a gun, every snap of a twig a footstep at their heels. The terror was a physical thing, a clawing beast on her back, whispering that they would never make it. And then, a new light began to grow behind them. It wasn't the clean, white light of a flashlight. It was a hungry, angry orange that flickered and danced, painting the undersides of the leaves in hellish hues. It grew brighter, casting their own long, fleeing shadows in front of them. A sickening, familiar smell reached her, the smell of gasoline and burning wood. They were burning it. They were burning her truck, their shelter, what was left of her old life, and the fragile new one she'd tried to build. They were erasing her. The orange glow illuminated Luke's face, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down his soot-stained cheeks. Helen pulled him closer, her heart a wild, frantic drum of pure fear, and ran harder into the suffocating darkness ahead. They burst out of the tree line onto the cold, hard shoulder of the county highway. The sudden open space was as terrifying as the claustrophobic woods. Helen's lungs were on fire, her legs trembling with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in her bones. Luke was sobbing, a high, thin sound of pure terror. Behind them, the orange glow of the fire pulsed against the clouds, a monstrous, breathing thing. Then, a pair of familiar, dim headlights rounded a bend. It was Sam's old truck. He pulled over with a squeal of worn brakes, his face a grim mask in the dashboard light. He had created a diversion on the main track, buying them precious minutes. He bundled them into the cab, the smell of old coffee and safety filling Helen's senses. He didn't speak, just handed her a cell phone. On the other end, a calm, clear voice spoke from a world away, a world of law and order. "My name is David Miller. I'm Sam's nephew. Tell me everything." His voice was the first note of a new and unfamiliar song, Hope. David's voice was an anchor in her sea of panic. He was a human rights attorney in Washington, D.C., and his tone was devoid of disbelief, filled only with calm, methodical purpose. "Listen to me very carefully, Helen," he said, his words cutting through her fear. "Do not go to the local police. Do not talk to anyone in Harmony Creek. Warren Caldwell owns that town. You are not safe there. Sam is going to drive you to the state capitol. There is an FBI field office at One Federal Plaza. You will go there and ask for Special Agent Connolly. Tell her you have evidence pertaining to a multi-decade racketeering and homicide investigation. Use those exact words." Each instruction was a stepping stone out of the nightmare. Helen felt a sob of relief catch in her throat. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't just running from something, she was running to something. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness, and her testimony was a weapon. The weight of the box felt different now. Not a curse, but a responsibility. The drive to the Capitol was a long, silent vigil. Sam's truck rattled along the dark highways, leaving the haunted mountains behind them. The farther they got from Harmony Creek, the more Helen felt the suffocating grip of fear begin to loosen, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She sat in the passenger seat, the heavy canvas bag on her lap, her hand resting on it protectively. Luke was finally asleep in the back, his face peaceful for the first time in days. Helen watched the dark. Rural landscape slowly give way to the anonymous glow of city lights, each streetlight a small victory against the darkness that had tried to consume them. She felt the profound weight of Benjamin Reed's last wish, his desperate bid for justice now resting entirely on her shoulders. She was his ghost, his messenger, carrying his final words out of the ashes. A fierce determination burned in her chest, a fire far stronger than the one Caldwell's men had set. She would not let Benjamin down. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. The FBI building was an imposing fortress of glass and concrete, a monument to the impersonal power of the federal government. It felt like another planet compared to the decaying ruin she had called home. Walking into the sterile and quiet lobby, Helen felt small and insignificant, her mud-stained clothes and wild-eyed fear completely out of place. Her heart pounded with a new anxiety, the fear of not being believed, of being dismissed as a hysterical woman with a wild story. Sam's steady presence beside her was a comfort. He walked to the counter, his back straight, and spoke to the agent behind the bulletproof glass. "We're here to see Special Agent Connolly," he said, his voice firm. "David Miller sent us." The name worked like a key. The agent looked at them, then back at her computer, and a moment later, a definitive buzz echoed through the lobby. A heavy steel door clicked open. They had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. They were inside the machine. The interrogation room was small, cold, and windowless. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of law enforcement. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor introduced herself as Agent Connolly. She listened without interruption, as Helen, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger with conviction, told her story. The entire sordid tale, from the eviction to the terror in the woods. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, with hands that shook only slightly, Helen heaved the rusty metal box onto the polished table. The sound was a dull, heavy thud of finality. She opened the lid. She carefully placed the leather-bound journal on the table first. Then, she took a deep breath and upended the box. The raw diamonds cascaded out with a sound like falling ice, a river of cold fire that glittered with impossible brilliance under the harsh fluorescent lights. Agent Connolly's professional mask finally slipped. Her eyes widened, and a single, sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. The atmosphere in the building shifted instantly from passive listening to a whirlwind of focused activity. The journal was whisked away by a team in gloves, its fragile pages treated with the reverence of a sacred text. The diamonds were carefully bagged, catalogued, and sent to a lab for verification. Helen and Luke were escorted to a clean, safe room, while Sam was debriefed in another. For hours, Helen answered questions, the same story told over and over, each telling solidifying the truth, cementing the facts into a weapon. She felt utterly drained, a hollowed-out shell. But beneath the exhaustion was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years: safety. The heavy burden she had carried alone was now being shouldered by the full, formidable weight of the federal government. She was no longer prey. The hunt had been reversed. Caldwell thought he was a king in his small, dark kingdom, but he had no idea that the world was far bigger, and its justice far longer, than his reign of terror. Justice came with the rising sun. Helen wasn't there to see it, but Agent Connolly described it to her later with grim satisfaction. A convoy of black, unmarked SUVs had stormed Caldwell's sprawling ranch in a coordinated pre-dawn raid. They didn't use the pristine main gate. They breached the walls. The sounds of splintering wood and shouted commands, "FBI, show me your hands," had shattered the morning peace. Warren Caldwell, the untouchable titan of Harmony Creek, was dragged from his bed, his face a mask of furious disbelief as the cold dual hard steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The man who had built an empire on fear and murder was rendered powerless in his pajamas. Simultaneously, raids across the county swept up his network: the corrupt sheriff, the complicit town officials, the two henchmen who had burned her truck. The spider's web, woven over decades of violence and silence, was torn apart in a single, decisive morning. The reign of the king was over. The months that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. The trial became a sensation, a dark fable of rural greed and corruption brought to light. Benjamin Reed's journal was the star witness, its pages a damning, irrefutable voice from the grave that spoke for dozens of victims. Warren Caldwell was convicted on a mountain of charges, including multiple counts of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, a forgotten old man. Then came the matter of the diamonds. David Miller, Sam's nephew, represented Helen. After a lengthy civil forfeiture case, the court ruled. Since the original owners of the diamonds were long-dead victims of Caldwell's crimes with no traceable heirs, the law dictated that the treasure belonged to its finder. When David called Helen with the final valuation, she had to sit down. The number was surreal, a string of zeros that didn't seem real. She had gone from having $500 to her name to possessing a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. A year later, the air on the property no longer smelled of ash and decay. It smelled of freshly mown grass, blooming wildflowers, and the sweet scent of baking bread wafting from the window of a beautiful new home. The house stood on the same foundation, but it was a place of light and life. The great stone chimney had been painstakingly preserved and integrated into the living room, a massive, proud monument to the man who had hidden his hope within its stones. Outside, Luke's laughter echoed across a sun-drenched lawn as he threw a ball for Buster, who had officially retired from guard duty to become a family pet. Helen stood in her new kitchen, a warm, bright space filled with modern appliances. She watched her son, her heart so full of a peaceful, profound joy it felt like it might burst. This place, once the symbol of her absolute failure, was now her sanctuary, a home built not just with money, but with courage, justice, and the enduring power of a good man's legacy. She was no longer just a seamstress, she was a creator again. Her new sewing room was a sanctuary of light and color, filled with bolts of silk and cotton. The gentle hum of her machine was a constant, soothing song of peace. That evening, Sam sat at her long wooden dining table, a table groaning with a feast she had prepared: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from her own garden, a warm apple pie. The scene was a universe away from the cold crackers and despair in the cab of her old truck. She had not only secured a future for her son, she had given a voice to the voiceless and, in doing so, had found her own. Looking at the proud stone chimney, she knew Benjamin Reed had finally found his peace in too. Helen's story is a powerful reminder that even in the deepest despair, courage can unearth a path to redemption. If her journey from ruin to resilience moved you, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss another story of the extraordinary strength found in ordinary people.